All right, AP Environmental. Today I want to give you just kind of a short video lecture on the human population. We're going to actually talk a lot about this the next couple of days, and I'm kind of hoping to maybe finish this up maybe by middle of next week. But I think it's a really interesting topic. We're going to discuss a lot of the current trends in our population growth. We'll talk about kind of the history of our population growth as far as what has kind of led to our current population size of about 7.8 billion people on this planet. And I'm going to be referring a lot throughout the year to a lot of environmental problems that are directly linked to human population growth. We talked before, for example, about eutrophication, for example, overusing nitrogen and fertilizers and all this stuff getting into water and causing pollution. But again, a lot of that's directly related to human population size. So a lot of these things that we're going to talk about in this unit just deal with some of the factors that contribute to our human population size. But again, down the road, the rest of the year, we're going to talk a lot about the problems that eventually causes. So I first kind of want to talk about one particular country. I think it's a good way to introduce human populations. China, you're probably familiar with some of China's population issues that they've had. Maybe you've heard about the one-child policy that we'll talk about briefly today. But I think China is an interesting starting point to just sort of discuss and kind of get the ball rolling when it comes to human population. So if you're not familiar with China and kind of geographically, here it is. Obviously, it's over there in Asia. And I think what's kind of interesting about it is if you just kind of look at the size of it, most people don't really realize that China is pretty similar to the United States as far as this land area goes. I mean, it takes up a tremendous amount of space. It is one of the bigger countries in the world. In fact, it's bigger than the continent of Australia. But you'll notice that it kind of compares in size to the United States. I believe, the U.S. if you include Alaska, I think there's a little bit more land area, but China, is comparable to the U.S. as far as area goes. Now, China currently has 1.4 billion people living in that country, which is approximately 20% of the world's population. So if you think about this, one out of every five people in the world lives in this country. I mean, look, I mean, you see this global map, right? I mean, one out of every five people in the world lives in the country of China. So I think when we're talking about populations, I think we need to talk a little bit about China. It's the largest consumer of commercial products. They consume one third of the world's food, so that's pretty important. They're the largest polluter in the world, especially concerning two pollutants. One of them is carbon dioxide, which we've talked about before. The other one is sulfur dioxide, which basically is an emission from factories. So those two things are major air pollutants. One of them, CO2, is a greenhouse gas. SO2 is more of a contributor to like smog and just general health concerns involving air pollution. Seven out of the 10 most polluted cities in the world are in China. So, I mean, I think China, again, is worth talking about because one, it's massively overpopulated, and two, there's a lot of issues that are involved with that overpopulation, like food consumption and pollution. So how did China get so big? That's kind of the question because they weren't always this massively overpopulated country, and it kind of goes all the way back to the 1950s. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson. Maybe you learned a little bit about this in world history. I don't know if you did or not, but in the 1950s, this was after World War II. The government of China actually encouraged their families, their citizens, to have as many kids as possible. I mean, imagine in the United States Imagine if the president got on the news or get on the TV or something and literally told every citizen of the country to go out and have as many kids as possible. Imagine that. That would be kind of bizarre, right? But that's basically what they did in China. This was after the war, and they were promoting, basically national pride. I mean, they wanted people to go out and have as many kids as possible, and they looked at it as the more people that we have, the more Chinese citizens, the more powerful our nation is going to become. And this was the mindset for everybody in the entire country. Women were looked upon as being what they called hero mothers if they had more than three children. I mean, literally, like if you were a woman and you had your third child or more, I mean, you were put up on a pedestal and you were looked upon as being a national hero. I mean, again, that seems kind of strange, but that's what it was like back in the 1950s in China. Now, at the same time, kind of what was happening on a global scale, not just in China, was people were becoming healthier. There was more advances in medicine, agricultural practices were becoming much better and more efficient. People were living longer. Infant mortality, which I've discussed briefly before, the likelihood of a child living past 1 year of age, that was actually getting better. Like people, infants weren't dying as much. So, all of these things, along with this national mindset, led to a massive population boom. In just 10 years alone, in one decade, the population grew by over 100 million people. So that was kind of amazing. Now, fast forward to 1980. By 1980, this is 30 years later, the population was almost getting too big. China started to realize that that they don't have enough resources, they don't have enough land space to accommodate everybody. So they almost did a complete flip flop. They did, or they came up with something called the one child policy, which was a way to slow down the growth of the population. And basically, it was just a financial reward for the government. For example, if families had only two children, um, they got no reward whatsoever. Two children was like, okay, that's it. You don't get anything. If you had three or more children, you actually got deducted in your pay. They actually had a 10% reduction to your paycheck per child. If you only had one child, you actually got a financial reward from the government. So, I mean, think about that. I mean, think about the government actually paying people to not have kids and also causing you to pay more money if you had more than two kids. Right. So, I mean, kind of a very bizarre thing that was going on in China in the 80s. Now, unfortunately, there were some pretty severe consequences because of this. Um, Abortions were on the rise, infanticide, which is like just the abandoning of children, leaving them for dead. In some cases, I hate to say this, but it even got to the point where children were murdered, all because families didn't want to take, they couldn't afford the hit in their paycheck. Sterilizations, um, ways of birth control methods. I mean, those things were all much more common after this. So those things were kind of repercussions of this. But the result was that the fertility rate dropped. I mean, it did have an impact on China's population growth, at least as far as the growth rate goes. I want to show you something real quick on this. There's a little website I want to show you that kind of shows you the growth in China. This is a population pyramid here showing China back in 1950. You'll notice there was about 550 million people or so that lived in China. And that was about the time when the one child policy started coming into effect. So I'm going to kind of go up by 5 year increments. You can notice here, just in 5 years, you'll notice at the base of this pyramid, which is that 0 to 4 range, look at how much broader it got, right? I mean, a tremendous amount of children were being born. Another 5 years. Now you'll notice that bottom line, kind of went back down a little bit, but you'll notice how it bumped up a level. That's because those children are now 5 years older, right? So we're up to 660 million people just in 10 years. So over 100 million people were born in that time frame. And you'll just kind of notice, as we kind of go through 5 years later, kind of notice how this population pyramid is starting to change. Now, I'm going to go back a little bit. You notice in the 1980s, notice how this base is kind of getting a little bit smaller. That's because of the implementation of the one child policy. So you'll see how the shape of this pyramid is kind of changing. In fact, let's fast forward to today in China. And this is a much more stable population. We'll talk a little bit more about population age structures in a couple of days. But again, kind of going back to 1950, I mean, look at the population pyramid here and just look how it has changed leading all the way up to 2020. All right, where that base is much smaller compared to what it used to be. So that just kind of shows you some of the interesting changes to their population over the last whatever 50 years or so. All right, now that leads us to the rest of the world. Currently, the rest of the world is undergoing some significant growth. It says here every 5 days, the global human population increases by 1 million lives. So 1 million people are born on this planet, or not say born, I'm going to say 1 million people are introduced every single year, or I should say every 5 days. Approximately 1.8 million people are born and about 800,000 people die. Again, that's over 5 days. So you can do the math. I mean, we're adding 1 million people basically every 5 days, or maybe every week, however you kind of, a school week, maybe, however you want to look at that. The current human population, every year I have to change my notes. Last year, we were at 7.7 billion. So I just updated my notes today to show you that we're at 7.8 and growing. Here's another link to a website here that kind of gives you an idea of where we are. Right now, this is the current world's population, and you can just kind of see, the rate and how fast that number is going up. I think I've mentioned this before. Back in 1996, which was my first year teaching, we were at about 5.5 billion. So, just in, my 25 years or so of teaching, we've increased, more than 2 billion people on this planet. So that's kind of interesting to me, how fast the world's population is actually growing. That population ticker is kind of an interesting thing. So here's kind of a history, I suppose, of our growth. This kind of goes all the way back to 2 million years ago, but you can just kind of see the shape of this graph. And there we see that J-shaped curve. We see that exponential growth that really started taking off about maybe 200, 250 years ago, about the time of the Industrial Revolution and that general era of time. That's where the world's population really just took off like crazy. I want to introduce you to a guy by the name of Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus had an interesting idea, and he was around back in the late 1800s. And he said that, one day the global population is going to exceed its food supply. If you look at this graph here, kind of what we're talking about, the curved line here, represents population growth, which is growing exponentially. This dotted line, represents the population that could be fed by the current amount of food. And if we keep going the way that we're going, currently, what we're looking at is about 60 more years, maybe 65 more years. Because you'll notice that this dotted line is kind of representing fixed growth. It's kind of a linear thing. But again, we're growing. We're not growing linearly. Our population is growing exponentially. So there's going to come a point where we cross over that line. And when that happens, there's not going to be enough food to feed the entire world. So this was a thing that Thomas Malthus kind of predicted over like 100, whatever, 20 years ago or something. And we're always kind of thinking about this and saying, like, thinking like, what would happen if that really occurred? Now we've done a pretty good job over the years of innovating. We've come up with better ways to grow food. Like, for example, Fritz Haber, right? Fritz Haber he came up with that method to produce synthetic fertilizers and ammonia. That's allowed us to grow more crops. So we've been able to innovate there. Air travel has allowed us to distribute food quicker and easier. So if we innovate, maybe we can raise that bar so that we can stay above that rate of growth that we're currently under. But the question is, can we continue to innovate? A lot of people think that there's a limit to our innovations. There's only so much innovation that we can do so fast. And if we don't continue to innovate, then we're going to be in a lot of trouble. And we're going to go back to something like this. All right. So I want you to think about that. I think it's kind of an interesting thought of where we're headed in the future. Can we continue to innovate? Are there limits to human growth? Have we exceeded our carrying capacity? These are all like big picture questions that we don't really know the answers to, but they're kind of interesting things to ponder. All right, guys, I want to let you loose here today. Thanks for paying attention. Check out your Buzz Agenda, and I will see you guys soon.